Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Savannah Pewter ball python. It's one of the more interesting combinations in ball pythons, and I'd say one of the more challenging on several levels. So if you actually just take a look at the common name, the Savannah consists of 2 genes, the Pewter consists of 2 genes, so you would actually think there's 4 genes in this combination, where there's actually only 3. It actually consists of the pastel, the cinnamon, and the Mojave. And kind of the other difficult part about this combination is if you look at different examples, you actually go over to Morph Market and look at all the different examples of the same exact genes lined up side by side, you'll see extreme visual differences between different versions of the Savannah Pewter, which is pretty amazing. And then the other tricky part about this combination is when you start working other genes into the mix, a lot of times you'll get certain genes that work together to form a completely different visual dominance as far as the appearance. So sometimes when you're breeding it to other genes, sometimes you'll get really unexpected results that look nothing like you would expect when you work other genes into the combination. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you the potential of the Savannah Pewter ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on morphmarket.com and I want to show you the individual genes and how they come together to form the Savannah Pewter. And then I want to show you different versions of the combination so you can see the variability from one example of the Savannah Pewter to the other. And then I want to show you working some other genes into the combination, how it can dramatically change the visual appearance using certain genes into the mix, making a completely different looking snake. It's pretty amazing working different genes into this combination. So the first one I want to start with is this snake right here. This is a Mojave, and the Mojave is a pretty interesting gene. It's actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, and I'd say when most people think of a blue-eyed leucistic, what they're actually thinking of is a completely white snake with blue eyes. And when it comes to the Mojave is kind of like right on the edge. Sometimes it'll actually make white snakes if you mix it with the right genes. So for example, if you actually have like a Mojave bamboo or a Mojave lesser or a Mojave Russo, you'll end up with a white snake. But in some cases with the Mojave, you'll end up with, technically it's considered a blue-eyed leucistic, but it's not a white snake. So for example, you can actually have, for example, the Purple Passions or the Mystic Potions, which are kind of purplish colored snakes. You can also work special in with the Mojave and make the crystals, which is one of my favorite combinations. It's like a yellow ball python. Technically it's a blue-eyed leucistic, but it's really like a bright yellow in some cases. I absolutely love the crystals with the Mojave, the special and the Mojave. So here's another gene in the Savannah Pewter, and that is the cinnamon. And I think this is really where a lot of the variability comes from when you're looking at the different versions of the Savannah Pewter, because the cinnamon can be extremely variable from one cinnamon to the other. And the cinnamon is actually a dark gene. Sometimes you'll actually get kind of this reddish, almost like a coppery color, almost like a coppery bronze color on some of your cinnamons. It's almost like a cinnamon color on some of your cinnamons. And then some of them can actually look like a really dark normal without a lot of the cinnamon color with your combinations. And a lot of times on the cinnamon, you'll actually see kind of a jumbled up pattern on the side. A lot of times you'll actually see some streaking on the side, especially when you work it in with certain combinations. So here's what happens if you take the cinnamon and you work it in with the Mojave, you get the Mojave cinnamon. And this combination just by itself can be extremely variable. So take a look at this one. This one is, I actually pulled up 2 different examples of the Mojave cinnamon that look completely different. And this one actually has a lot of streaking on the side, which is pretty typical when you work cinnamon in with other combinations. Let's say maybe about 50% of the time, you'll get really strong streaking. And on this one, you can actually see a lot of the cinnamon color coming through in the combination. So I pulled up another cinnamon Mojave over here, otherwise known as the Savannah, and take a look at this. It looks completely different. You don't really see the streaking on the side, and you really don't see the cinnamon color in this combination, even though it's exactly the same genetics as the example before. So So here is the last gene in the Savannah Pewter, and that is the pastel. And I'd say when most people think of the pastel, they're thinking of a yellow snake. But kind of the interesting thing, if you actually work pastel in with the cinnamon, you get the pewter, which is a really visually dominant combination. It's kind of interesting when you work certain genes together. Sometimes you get a really strong visual dominance that can completely overwhelm all the other genes in the combination, or really dominate the visual appearance. And it really depends on which two genes you mix together. Sometimes you add a certain gene and it'll completely change it because it pairs up with another gene and changes the visual dominance in that combination. So here's what happens if you actually combine all the genes, the pastel, the cinnamon, and the Mojave. You actually get the Savannah Pewter, which is this snake right here. And kind of the interesting thing about this combination is it has quite a few different common names. And if you actually come over here to Morph Market, I'd say most of the times people will list them as Mojave Pewters, which is kind of an interesting combination. So the combination of the cinnamon and the pastel is actually the pewter. So this is the Mojave Pewter. You could also call this, so the combination of the pastel and the Mojave is the Pastavi. So you can actually call this a cinnamon Pastavi, which is another name for also the Savannah Pewter. So this combination actually has 3 names, which is pretty wild. Actually 4 names. A lot of people just list out the genes. So this is actually the cinnamon pastel Mojave. Some people just say that. So I actually pulled up 3 different extreme versions of the Savannah Pewter. And let me tell you, this will probably blow you away if you haven't seen this before. So this is a Savannah Pewter, and here is another example of the Savannah Pewter, the same exact genes. And look at how silver this snake is. It's pretty amazing. And I actually pulled up one more version over here. Take a look at this. This is, believe it or not, this is actually the same combination, the Mojave Pewter, otherwise known as the Savannah Pewter, which is pretty amazing. So if you look at all these 3 different examples of the combination, so like in this one, you can see on this particular example, you can see a lot of the cinnamon color really coming through the combination. You can see a lot of the streaking from the combination of the cinnamon and the Mojave coming together. And then on this combination, it really depends on which version of cinnamon you use, and I think to a lesser degree which version of pastel that you use in with the cinnamon. Sometimes you can get the pewters, the pastel cinnamons, that come together to form kind of a silvery snake. And if you can actually hit the really silver pewters, I find in a lot of cases it's really visually dominant and can completely mask all the colors of a lot of the other genes that you mix in with these silver colored pewters, which is probably one of my favorite pewters, the really silver one. I guess it really depends on what the visual effect is that you're going for, but I really love the silver pewters. And on this one is completely different. You can actually see a little bit of the cinnamon color coming through. It's pretty amazing on this one how it's completely different than the other ones. I would say if you're actually breeding this, if you have like a whole different combination of genes in 2 snakes and you breed them together not really realizing which version of the genes you have, I would think it would be extremely difficult to identify what you actually have, because you can produce so many visual effects as far as the same genes coming together. Sometimes people show me, hey, what are the genes in this snake? And sometimes even, knowing the genes, sometimes it's really difficult to pick out all the different genes in the combinations, especially since they're so variable from one example to the other. So take a look at this one. This one's actually the same thing with the addition of one more copy of the pastel. So this is the super pastel version of the same combination. And it's kind of interesting. So the combination of the super pastel and the cinnamon makes the sterling. So this is a sterling Mojave, which gets really variable in this case too. So it really depends on which version of cinnamon you use in this case too. So sometimes you can make these really silvery colored sterlings. And I'd say usually the sterlings do have quite a bit of silver color. And a lot of times it'll be completely washed out on top of the snake with the addition of one more copy of the pastel. So here's one of my favorite combinations, working pinstripe into the Savannah Pewter. And let me tell you, the pinstripe is definitely one of my favorite genes. It's one of the goldest genes, like a bright gold gene, which makes some pretty amazing combinations. And here's what happens if you work the pinstripe into the Savannah Pewter. You get the Leatherface. You may have heard of the Leatherface. It's not really that common. It's a pretty amazing combination, and it completely changes the visual appearance of this one. So what's actually happening in this combination, you'll actually get the combination of the pastel and the pinstripe, which is otherwise known as the lemon blast. And the combination of the pastel and the pinstripe is really visually dominant. So when you work other genes into a lemon blast combination, a lot of times the lemon blast will really shine through, as far as you can definitely see the really shattered pattern of the combination of the pastel and the pinstripe. And you can actually see the cinnamon kind of coming through with the cinnamon color in this case, which is a pretty interesting combination. So there's actually quite a few different names for this combination too. You can call this the Leatherface. You could also call this, it would actually be the Pinstripe Savannah Sterling would be another name for this. Or so you can actually take, so for example, the Pastel Pinstripe Cinnamon would be the Pewter Blast is another common name. So this would actually be like a Mojave Pewter Blast. Or you can actually say the combination of the Pastel and the Pinstripe is the Lemon Blast. So it's kind of like a Lemon Blast Savannah. There's so many different common names. And a lot of times you'll come up to the tables at the reptile shows and you'll see something listed like a Leatherface or this really weird common name. And a lot of times you'll actually have to ask, what are the genes in that combination? Because there's so many different common names for these. It's pretty amazing. So here is the GHI, and so if you actually add GHI, it completely changes the visual appearance of the combination. The GHI is a dark gene, so a lot of times when you work GHI into other combinations, it really darkens the background of your combinations, and a lot of times it'll actually scramble up the pattern. And this is probably one of the best GHIs I've seen. Look at how gold it is. Pretty amazing. Just a single gene, the GHI. And the interesting thing is if you take GHI and work it in with Mojave, you get the Mojave GHIs, which is really visually dominant by itself. So here's what happens if you take the GHI and work it into the Savannah Pewter. Take a look at this. It completely changes the visual appearance of this combination. And essentially what's happening is you're getting the GHI working together with the Mojave to really dominate the visual appearance. As a matter of fact, it almost looks like kind of like a little bit faded out of a GHI Mojave, which is pretty crazy. And then it's kind of interesting on this one too, because you have the pewter, which is also really visually dominant with the pastel and the cinnamon. It's kind of interesting if you look at the visual dominance of two different genes at a time compared to other two genes. It's pretty interesting which one will dominate the other ones. And this one, the GHI Mojave, definitely dominates the visual appearance of the pewter. So here's the last one I wanted to show you, and that is working special into the Savannah Pewter. And the special is a really subtle gene, but it's actually in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. And the special is a component of the crystal when you work it in with the Mojave. And the other thing is you have to kind of take into consideration if you actually make a blue-eyed leucistic, even though it's not a completely white snake, a lot of times those combinations will have more visual dominance when it comes to dominating the visual effect of your combination. So here's what happens if you take the special and you work it into the Savannah Pewter. Take a look at this. You get a completely different effect in this case. Essentially what you're getting is you're getting a crystal with the pewter underneath the crystal. You can see the pewter kind of like reduces a lot of the pattern on the side. Usually your crystals will have a lot of the pattern. Almost looks like, I'd say almost like a Mojave kind of a pattern on the side of most of your crystals, where it has the really big open patterns on the side. And then you add the pewter to the crystal, kind of changes the pattern, but you really have the visual dominance from the crystal, the combination of the special and the Mojave. And let me tell you, if I was to actually get any blue-eyed leucistic that was not completely white, it would probably be the crystal, which is pretty amazing. As a matter of fact, I almost bought a crystal when I started in ball pythons, but I decided to get into other genes. There's so many genes, but it was actually on my top 10 list. The crystals are pretty awesome. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Jarrett Mims asks, how do I avoid getting scammed on Morph Market? And that is a very good question. So yes, Morph Market is kind of like the eBay for reptiles. We have hundreds and hundreds of sellers coming together and selling ball pythons and other reptiles on one website over on morphmarket.com. And as far as I've seen, I really haven't seen a lot of people getting scammed or having problems over there. They do have a lot of protections in place. Probably the number one place I would start is if you're interested in a ball python, you can go to the seller's profile and look at some of the reviews for that seller. And a lot of times if you actually look at the seller and they have all 5-star reviews, I'd say you're pretty safe buying from that seller. And the other thing I would definitely use is PayPal. If you actually pay through PayPal, PayPal itself has protections against online scams. As a matter of fact, I actually bought a tarantula online. It wasn't from Morph Market, it was from another website. And I had some problems where they wanted me to pay more money and wouldn't ship me the tarantula. And finally, after a few weeks, I was like, all right, I want my refund. They wouldn't send me a refund. I contacted PayPal, and with just one contact, I think it was just like an email or a chat or something over on PayPal, they instantly refunded me all my money for the purchase price of that tarantula. So that is one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is if you're using PayPal, I would probably avoid doing friends and family because I don't think there's any protections if you pay for friends and family over on PayPal. You'll have to pay a little bit extra if you do it the regular. I think it's like another 2 or 3%, but you do have the protection as far as using PayPal. And if people want to do friends and family, I would probably only do it if you really know the person really well, or if they have some really good ratings over on their store. But I would probably prefer, personally me, I would probably never do friends and family. I would always pay the regular way, pay a little extra money and get the protection through PayPal. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.